A black man stands on the deck of a wooden fishing boat as the sun rises over the Persian Gulf. Salt wind, rusting cranes, oil tankers on the horizon. But this man isn't a visitor. His family has been sailing these waters for generations. And if you ask him where his ancestors came from, he'll tell you something most people outside this region have never heard: Africa. Because hidden along the southern coast of Iran is a community of black people whose ancestors arrived here centuries ago. Some came as enslaved people, some came as sailors, some came as soldiers. But once they arrived, they became the backbone of the Persian Gulf economy, diving for pearls, sailing trading ships, working the ports that connected Africa, Arabia, India, and Persia. And yet today, most people in the world have no idea they exist. They are called Afro-Iranians. And without them, the Persian Gulf would never have become one of the most important trading regions on Earth. For hundreds of years, the Persian Gulf wasn't powered by oil. It was powered by ships. Wooden sailing vessels called dhows moved goods between East Africa, Arabia, Persia, and India, and the men working those ships were often African. Many of them came from places like Tanzania, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Somalia. Some arrived as traders. Many arrived through the Indian Ocean slave trade. Over time, these Africans settled in the southern provinces of Iran, including Hormozgan, Khuzestan. Today, those communities are known as Afro-Iranians, descendants of Africans who arrived through centuries of trade and migration. But what most history books leave out is the role they played in building the maritime economy of the region. They were the sailors, the dock workers, the pearl divers, the fishermen, the men who actually kept the Gulf alive. And in some port cities, they became entire communities. The work that built the Persian Gulf economy was brutal. Long before oil tankers and container ships dominated these waters, the Gulf ran on something else entirely: pearls. For centuries, natural pearls from the Persian Gulf were some of the most valuable luxury goods in the world. Royal courts in Europe, India, and the Ottoman Empire all wanted them. A single perfect pearl could sell for the equivalent of thousands of dollars today. But pearls didn't come out of factories. They came from the seabed. And getting them required men willing to dive into the ocean over and over again, day after day, for months at a time. That job fell largely to the poorest people along the coast, which meant many of the divers were Africans or descendants of Africans who had been brought into the region through the Indian Ocean slave trade. The work was relentless. A diver would wrap a rope around his waist and attach a stone weight to his feet. When the signal was given, he would leap off the side of the boat and sink rapidly toward the ocean floor, sometimes reaching depths of 10 to 20 meters. He had no oxygen tank, no modern diving equipment, just a nose clip, a small basket, and lungs strong enough to hold air for as long as possible. At the bottom, he would scramble across the seabed, grabbing oysters as quickly as he could before his lungs began to burn. Then the crew above would haul him back up using the rope tied around his waist. A strong diver might repeat this process 30 or 40 times in a single day. Some did it more than 100 times, for months, in scorching heat, in waters filled with sharks and jellyfish. And even after all that work, most oysters contained nothing valuable at all. Thousands had to be opened to find a single pearl worth selling. But when a valuable pearl was discovered, the wealth it generated rarely went to the divers themselves. It flowed upward, to ship owners, to merchants, to rulers who taxed the trade moving through their ports. Meanwhile, the men who actually pulled the pearls from the ocean often remained trapped in cycles of debt and poverty that passed from one generation to the next. And many of those men were Afro-Iranian. In some coastal towns, entire communities formed around this industry. Families of divers, sailors, rope makers, boat builders, and dock workers lived in neighborhoods that revolved around the rhythm of the sea. The diving season would begin when the waters warmed and continue for months. During that time, fleets of boats left the ports together, sometimes hundreds at a time, spreading across the Gulf in search of oyster beds. The scene must have been extraordinary. Wooden vessels stretching to the horizon, crews singing rhythmic work songs to coordinate the pulling of ropes, divers slipping beneath the waves again and again while the sun baked the deck above them. And beneath all of that activity was a system that tied the region together economically. Pearls harvested in the Gulf were shipped to trading centers in places like Bombay, Basra, and Istanbul. From there, they moved even further outward into global markets. This meant that small coastal towns in southern Iran were connected to an international luxury trade long before oil ever made the region famous. And Afro-Iranian labor was deeply embedded in that system, but pearls weren't the only industry that depended on them. Fishing fleets along the southern coast also relied heavily on Afro-Iranian sailors. Generations of families learned the tides, the currents, and the seasonal movements of fish in ways that only come from centuries of experience. They worked the docks. They maintained the boats. They navigated the narrow shipping routes connecting the Gulf to the Indian Ocean. In other words, they were not just present in the region. They were essential to how the region functioned. Yet if you open most history books about Iran, you will barely see them mentioned. Instead, the focus tends to stay on imperial dynasties, religious movements, or modern political events centered around Tehran. The coastal provinces where Afro-Iranian communities live rarely receive the same attention, which means the people who built much of the Gulf's maritime economy remain largely invisible in the historical record, and that invisibility has consequences. Because when an entire community's past is ignored, it becomes easier for their present struggles to be ignored as well. Many Afro-Iranian communities today still live in the same southern regions where their ancestors once worked the sea. Places like Hormozgan province remain among the least economically developed parts of the country. Infrastructure is limited. Job opportunities are scarce. And despite the enormous wealth that now flows through the Persian Gulf because of oil and shipping, very little of it reaches the small coastal neighborhoods where many Afro-Iranian families live. But culture has a way of surviving even when history tries to erase it. And along the southern coast of Iran, there are still traces of Africa that have never completely disappeared. You can hear it in the music. You can see it in certain ceremonies. You can feel it in the rhythms of community gatherings that carry echoes of traditions from across the ocean. Those traditions are reminders that the story of Afro-Iranians is not just a story about slavery or hardship. It is also a story about endurance. Because despite centuries of exploitation, invisibility, and poverty, these communities did not vanish. They adapted, they built families, they created culture, and they remained part of the fabric of the Persian Gulf. The question is why so few people outside the region know anything about them. To answer that, we have to look at what happened when the pearl economy collapsed. And a completely different industry transformed the Gulf forever: oil. Everything changed in the early 20th century. For hundreds of years, the Persian Gulf economy had revolved around the sea. Fishing, shipping, and especially pearls kept the ports alive. Entire towns were built around the diving season. Then, almost overnight, that world collapsed. The reason wasn't a war, it wasn't a storm, it was technology. In the 1920s and 1930s, Japanese innovators perfected a method of producing cultured pearls. Instead of sending divers to the seabed hoping to find a valuable oyster, pearl farmers could grow them inside controlled oyster farms. The result was devastating for the Gulf. Cultured pearls flooded the global market and sold for a fraction of the price of natural pearls. Buyers who once depended on the Persian Gulf suddenly had a cheaper alternative. Demand collapsed. Within a generation, the industry that had supported thousands of families along the southern coast simply disappeared. For the Afro-Iranian communities that had depended on pearl diving and maritime labor, the consequences were immediate. Boats stopped leaving the harbors. Dockyards went quiet. Merchants who once financed diving fleets shut down their operations. Entire coastal economies shrank almost overnight. The divers who had spent their lives underwater suddenly had no industry left to support them. And just as this crisis was unfolding, another transformation was beginning in the region: oil. In 1908, a massive oil discovery in southwestern Iran marked the beginning of a new economic era for the country. Over the following decades, petroleum slowly replaced older industries as the foundation of the national economy. At first glance, this might seem like good news for the struggling coastal communities: a new resource, a new source of wealth, a chance for economic recovery. But the benefits of the oil boom were not evenly distributed. The infrastructure and investment connected to Iran's oil industry focused largely on specific regions and strategic locations controlled by state institutions and foreign companies. Meanwhile, many of the smaller coastal communities that had once relied on maritime trade remained outside those development zones. In practical terms, that meant the economic transition that enriched parts of Iran left other areas behind. The southern coastal provinces, where many Afro-Iranian families lived, did not suddenly become centers of oil wealth. Instead, they remained among the most economically marginalized regions in the country. While oil revenues flowed into national development projects, modern cities, and government programs centered around major urban areas, the smaller port towns continued to struggle with limited resources and infrastructure. Generations that had once survived through maritime labor now faced a different kind of challenge: finding a place in a rapidly changing national economy that had little need for the skills their ancestors had passed down. Fishing remained important for some communities, but it could not replace the scale of the pearl economy that had once sustained entire towns. Some Afro-Iranian families found work in shipping or port labor as modern cargo trade expanded. Others moved north toward larger cities in search of jobs, but economic mobility remained limited. Over time, this gap between regions became more visible. The Persian Gulf grew into one of the most strategically valuable areas in the world because of its energy reserves and shipping routes. Tankers carrying oil began crossing the same waters where pearl fleets once operated. Yet the people living in many of the coastal neighborhoods closest to those routes saw only a fraction of the wealth passing by. This pattern, Massive economic activity in the region combined with persistent poverty in local communities became one of the defining realities of life along parts of Iran's southern coast, and it shaped the modern experience of Afro-Iranians in ways that are rarely discussed outside the country. Despite their deep historical presence in the region, Afro-Iranians remain largely absent from national narratives about Iranian identity and history. You can travel through southern port cities and see the physical reminders of that history everywhere. Neighborhoods where African features are common, music that carries rhythms connected to East African traditions, and family stories passed down about ancestors who crossed the Indian Ocean generations ago. But those stories rarely appear in textbooks, official histories, or political discussions about the country's past. Part of that absence comes from the broader way Iranian society tends to frame its identity. National narratives often emphasize ancient Persian civilizations, Islamic history, and modern political developments. Communities whose histories fall outside those central themes are often overlooked. For Afro-Iranians, that means their story exists largely at the local level, in family histories, cultural practices, and oral traditions, rather than in the official version of the nation's past. And yet their presence has shaped the southern coast for centuries. The ports they worked in became gateways connecting Iran to Africa, Arabia, and South Asia. The maritime skills passed down through generations helped sustain Gulf trade long before the modern shipping industry appeared. Their cultural traditions added new layers to the region's identity, blending African influences with Persian and Arab customs in ways that created something unique to the Gulf. Today, those traditions remain visible in everyday life, in certain coastal festivals, in distinctive musical styles, and in ceremonies that preserve fragments of memory stretching back across the ocean to East Africa. These cultural expressions are not relics of a vanished past. They are living evidence that the African presence in the Persian Gulf did not disappear after the slave trade ended or after the pearl economy collapsed. It adapted, it changed form, and it survived. Which raises an uncomfortable question that very few people outside the region ever stop to consider. If communities with African roots have been part of Iran's southern coast for centuries, working its seas, building its ports, and shaping its culture, why does the rest of the world know almost nothing about them? One reason the world knows so little about Afro-Iranians is that the story of the Persian Gulf has been rewritten around oil. Once petroleum became the central economic force in the region, almost everything else disappeared from the narrative. International media, academic research, and geopolitical discussions all began focusing on the same topics: energy markets, military strategy, and political power. When people talk about southern Iran today, the conversation usually revolves around oil tankers, naval bases, and the narrow waterway that connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. But long before those tankers existed, this coastline was already a crossroads of civilizations. African traders sailed here. Arab merchants built ports here. Persian sailors carried goods across the Indian Ocean from here. For centuries, southern Iran functioned as a meeting point between Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. People moved back and forth constantly, some freely as merchants and sailors, others forcibly through systems of slavery that tied these regions together. Over time, those movements created communities that did not fit neatly into the national identities that modern countries later tried to construct. Afro-Iranians are one example of that. Their ancestors came from multiple parts of East Africa. Some were brought to the Gulf as laborers. Others arrived as sailors or traders who eventually settled in coastal towns. Once there, they married into local populations, learned Persian languages, and adapted to the customs of the region. Generations later, their descendants became part of the social fabric of southern Iran. But because their story crosses oceans and cultures, it does not always appear clearly in official histories. Modern nation-states tend to organize their past around clear boundaries: one country, one people, one narrative. The history of the Indian Ocean world doesn't work that way. It's a story of constant movement. Ships crossing between Africa, Arabia, Persia, and India. Families forming across cultural lines. Languages and traditions blending together in port cities where traders from multiple continents live side by side. Afro-Iranian communities emerged from that environment. Their identity reflects centuries of interaction between Africa and the Persian Gulf, an interaction that shaped everything from trade routes to cultural traditions. In some coastal neighborhoods, you can still see that blend clearly. People might speak Persian dialects at home, but cook foods with ingredients and techniques connected to East African cuisine. Musicians play rhythms that echo patterns found along the Swahili coast. Family names and oral histories sometimes trace connections back to specific African regions, even if those connections have become distant over generations. These cultural fragments act almost like historical fingerprints. They remind us that the Persian Gulf was never isolated. It was part of a much larger network linking 3 continents, and the people who lived along its shores carried those connections in their daily lives. Yet when global attention turns to Iran today, those stories rarely enter the conversation. Instead, headlines focus on nuclear negotiations, sanctions, military tensions, and regional rivalries. Those topics dominate international coverage because they affect global politics. But they also have an unintended side effect. They flatten the complexity of the country itself. Iran is often portrayed as a single, unified political entity defined entirely by its government and its geopolitical role. In reality, it contains a wide range of regional cultures and histories that stretch far beyond modern politics. The southern coast is one of those places where history runs deeper than the headlines suggest. Here, the legacy of the Indian Ocean world still lingers in ways that are easy to overlook if you don't know what to look for. You might hear it in a style of drumming played during community celebrations. You might notice it in the way certain dances move differently from those in northern parts of the country. You might see it in family stories that speak about ancestors arriving from across the sea generations ago. For the people who live there, these elements are simply part of everyday life. For outsiders, they can be surprising because they challenge the common assumption that Africa and the Middle East exist as completely separate historical worlds. In truth, those worlds have been connected for thousands of years. Trade winds carried ships between them long before modern borders existed. Merchants, scholars, sailors, and laborers traveled those routes repeatedly, creating communities that reflected multiple cultural influences at once. Afro-Iranians are part of that larger story. Their history does not begin or end with slavery, even though slavery played a role in bringing many of their ancestors to the region. It continues through centuries of adaptation and survival, through families building lives in coastal towns, through cultural traditions passed quietly from one generation to the next through people who grew up knowing that their identity carried pieces of two different continents at once. And that dual heritage raises an important point. When we talk about the African diaspora, most people immediately think of the Atlantic world, the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe. But the diaspora is far bigger than that. African communities formed across the Indian Ocean as well, in places like Oman, Pakistan, India, and Iran. Their stories unfolded along different routes, shaped by different historical forces, but they remain part of the same global movement of people that reshaped societies across multiple continents. Understanding that broader picture changes how we think about world history. It reveals connections that traditional narratives often ignore, and it reminds us that the boundaries between cultures have never been as rigid as modern maps make them appear. Which brings us back to the present. Because even though the Afro-Iranian story stretches back centuries, its future, like the future of many marginalized communities, depends on whether the wider world begins to notice it at all. Recognition matters more than people often realize. When a community's story is missing from the public record, it slowly fades from collective memory, not because the people disappear, but because the world stops looking for them. That has happened repeatedly in regions shaped by global trade. Ports rise, economies shift, empires collapse, and the communities that once held those systems together become footnotes. Afro-Iranians are one of those communities. They did not vanish when the pearl industry collapsed. They did not disappear when the oil economy reshaped the Gulf. They remained in the same coastal provinces their ancestors had lived in for generations. But their visibility changed, partly because the industries that once made their labor essential disappeared, partly because national histories began emphasizing different narratives about identity and development, and partly because global attention moved somewhere else. The modern Persian Gulf is one of the most strategically important regions in the world. Governments monitor shipping routes, energy markets, and military movements with intense focus. Yet the everyday lives of the people living along those coasts rarely appear in those conversations. This gap between geopolitical attention and social reality creates a strange situation. The region itself is constantly discussed, but many of its communities remain invisible. For Afro-Iranians, that invisibility has had real consequences. Economic development in Iran has often been uneven, with major investment concentrated in large cities and industrial zones. Rural and coastal areas in the south have historically received fewer resources, leaving many communities facing limited job opportunities and infrastructure. That reality has pushed some families to migrate internally. Young people leave small port towns to find work in larger cities. Others move toward industrial areas connected to shipping, construction, or energy production. Migration like this is common in many countries experiencing economic change, but it has a cultural side effect. When people move away from the places where traditions developed, those traditions can weaken over time. Languages shift. Local ceremonies become less frequent. Music that once defined community gatherings slowly fades as younger generations adapt to urban environments and national culture. Afro-Iranian traditions have faced that pressure for decades. Some customs survive in coastal neighborhoods where families remain concentrated. Certain ceremonies, particularly those connected to healing rituals and music, still preserve rhythms and movements with clear African influences. In these gatherings, Drums echo patterns that scholars have traced back to East African traditions carried across the Indian Ocean centuries ago. The instruments, the tempo, even the style of singing reflect cultural memories that traveled with the first generations of Africans who arrived in the Gulf. These practices serve an important role. They are not just performances, they are acts of preservation. Each time a ceremony takes place, it reinforces a sense of identity that might otherwise disappear in the face of broader cultural assimilation. But preservation alone cannot guarantee survival. Communities also need recognition. They need their stories documented, studied, and shared so they do not remain confined to local memory. In recent years, some researchers and journalists have begun paying more attention to the Afro-Iranian population. Anthropologists studying Gulf cultures have recorded oral histories, music traditions, and family narratives that provide a clearer picture of the community's past. These efforts are important because much of Afro-Iranian history was never written down in formal records. Like many marginalized groups throughout the world, their history lives primarily in oral storytelling, grandparents explaining where their ancestors came from, community elders describing old ceremonies and trade routes, fragments of memory preserved through music, dance, and everyday customs. When researchers document those stories, they create a bridge between local knowledge and global awareness. Suddenly, a community that once existed only in scattered family histories becomes part of a broader historical conversation. But awareness outside the region is still limited. If you ask most people around the world whether Iran has a population with African ancestry, the answer will almost always be confusion. Many assume African diaspora communities exist only in the Atlantic world. Others assume the Middle East remained culturally separate from Africa. Both assumptions overlook the long history of the Indian Ocean trade network. For centuries, ships connected the East African coast to the Persian Gulf, India, and Southeast Asia. Merchants moved ivory, spices, textiles, and gold along these routes, and people moved with them. Some traveled voluntarily as traders and sailors. Others were forced through systems of bondage that stretched across the ocean. Over generations, those movements created diaspora communities scattered across the Indian Ocean world. Afro-Iranians are part of that larger historical pattern. Their existence challenges the simplified maps many people carry in their heads about where cultures belong. Africa did not exist in isolation. Neither did the Middle East. Their histories intersected constantly through trade, migration, and empire. Understanding that intersection changes how we view both regions. It reveals that identity is rarely as simple as modern borders suggest, and it shows that cultural influence travels much farther than political narratives often acknowledge. For Afro-Iranians, that realization offers something powerful. It means their story is not just a small regional curiosity. It is part of a global history connecting 3 continents and centuries of movement across the Indian Ocean. But for that history to truly enter the world's understanding of the past, one more step still needs to happen. People outside the region have to start paying attention. Because once a forgotten story is finally seen, it becomes much harder to erase again. Paying attention to forgotten histories does more than correct the record. It changes how we understand the present. When a community's past is invisible, its modern challenges often look isolated or accidental. Poverty in a coastal town might seem like simple underdevelopment. cultural differences might look like anomalies. But once the deeper history becomes clear, those patterns start to make sense. The story of Afro-Iranians is a perfect example. For centuries, their ancestors lived in a region defined by maritime trade. Ports connected the Persian Gulf to East Africa, India, and Arabia. Sailors moved constantly between these worlds, carrying goods, ideas, languages, and people. African labor played a role in many of those maritime economies. Some Africans arrived as sailors working on merchant ships. Others were brought through systems of forced labor that existed across the Indian Ocean long before European colonial powers dominated the Atlantic slave trade. Once they arrived in the Gulf, many eventually became part of the coastal population. They worked in agriculture, fishing, domestic service, and maritime industries. Over generations, they built families, communities, and cultural traditions rooted in the Gulf itself. But the industries that sustained those communities were not permanent. The pearl economy collapsed in the early 20th century. Traditional maritime trade routes lost importance as modern shipping and national borders reshaped global commerce. Oil transformed the region's economy, but concentrated wealth in specific locations and sectors. These shifts didn't erase Afro-Iranian communities, but they changed the economic landscape around them. Jobs that once relied on physical maritime labor disappeared or were replaced by industrial systems requiring different skills. Ports that had once thrived on regional trade were overshadowed by large-scale commercial shipping hubs. Smaller coastal towns, many of which had significant Afro-Iranian populations, struggled to keep pace with the new economic structure. This pattern is not unique to Iran. Across the world, communities tied to older forms of labor often face the same challenge when industries evolve. Coal mining towns decline after energy transitions. Fishing villages shrink as industrial fleets dominate the seas. Traditional craft economies fade as manufacturing expands. In each case, the communities that built their identities around those industries must adapt quickly or risk being left behind. Afro-Iranians experienced that transformation during the 20th century. Some adapted by moving into new forms of work tied to the modern Gulf economy: port logistics, construction, shipping, and urban service industries. Others remained in smaller towns where economic opportunities were limited. Despite these challenges, one element of the community has proven remarkably resilient: cultural continuity. Even as industries changed and migration patterns shifted, certain traditions remained strong. Music is one of the clearest examples. In parts of southern Iran, ceremonial music performed during community gatherings still reflects African rhythmic structures. Drums create layered beats that differ from traditional Persian musical styles found in other regions of the country. Anthropologists who have studied these performances often note similarities to musical traditions along the East African coast. These rhythms are more than entertainment. They carry historical memory. Every drum pattern, every chant, every movement in these ceremonies echoes cultural practices that traveled across the Indian Ocean generations ago. Food traditions provide another example. Some coastal households prepare dishes using spices, cooking techniques, and ingredients that reveal connections to African and Indian Ocean cuisines. Over centuries, these recipes blended with Persian cooking, creating flavors unique to the Gulf Coast. Language also preserves traces of the past. While most Afro-Iranians speak Persian today, Certain local dialects include words and expressions believed to have African origins. Linguists studying Gulf dialects occasionally uncover vocabulary that cannot be traced to Persian, Arabic, or Turkic influences, but resembles terms used in East African languages. Each of these cultural elements acts like a historical clue. Together, they form a mosaic of evidence showing how deeply interconnected the Indian Ocean world once was. Yet these connections rarely appear in mainstream discussions of world history. Educational systems tend to divide the past into separate regional stories: African history, Middle Eastern history, South Asian history. The reality was far more interconnected. Sailors and merchants ignored those modern boundaries centuries ago. They followed monsoon winds across the ocean, linking distant coasts into a shared economic and cultural network. The Persian Gulf sat at the heart of that network, and Afro-Iranian communities are living evidence of how those connections shaped real human lives. Understanding this history also challenges a broader misconception. Many people assume that African diaspora communities outside Africa exist primarily because of the Atlantic slave trade. That trade certainly created vast diaspora populations across the Americas and the Caribbean, but it was not the only system moving African people across oceans. The Indian Ocean slave trade operated for over 1,000 years, connecting East Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia. Its scale and dynamics differ from the Atlantic system, but its human impact was profound. Communities formed along those routes as well. Some descendants live in Oman, others in Pakistan and India, and some in Iran's southern coastal provinces. Their histories remind us that global migration patterns long predate modern globalization. Long before airplanes or container ships existed, people were already moving across vast distances by sea. They carried cultures with them. They formed new identities in unfamiliar lands, and they left traces that still shape societies today, which leads to a final, important realization. Afro-Iranians are not simply a hidden minority within Iran. They are part of a much larger human story, one that stretches from the shores of East Africa across the Indian Ocean to the ports of the Persian Gulf, linking continents through centuries of movement, survival, and cultural exchange. Once you start looking at the Persian Gulf through that lens, the region begins to look very different. Instead of a narrow strip of coastline defined by oil exports and military tension, it becomes something older and more complex, a historical corridor linking Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. For thousands of years, ships moved through these waters following the rhythm of the monsoon winds. Sailors knew exactly when the seasonal winds would carry them west toward Africa or east toward India. Entire trading systems developed around those predictable patterns. Ports along the southern coast of Iran were part of that system. Merchants arrived with ivory from East Africa. Others brought spices and textiles from India. Dates, pearls, and horses left the Gulf in return. These exchanges created port cities where multiple cultures lived side by side. Languages blended together in markets. Religious ideas traveled with scholars and sailors. Families formed between people whose ancestors came from entirely different continents. Afro-Iranian communities emerged inside that environment. They were not isolated groups living separately from the rest of society. Over generations, they became integrated into the economic and social life of the coast. Some worked in maritime trades, others became farmers, fishermen, or craftsmen. What made these communities unique was not separation, but mixture. Their identity grew from the intersection of African ancestry and Persian Gulf culture. This blending is still visible today in certain coastal traditions. One example appears in healing ceremonies that combine spiritual elements with music and rhythm. These rituals involve drumming patterns and movements that scholars often connect to East African cultural practices carried across the ocean centuries ago. Participants gather in a communal setting where music builds slowly, creating an atmosphere that blends spirituality, performance, and cultural memory. These ceremonies are not widely known outside the region, but they illustrate something important. Cultural traditions can travel long distances and survive even when written records disappear. For Afro-Iranian communities, these practices function as a living archive of their past. Another visible influence appears in clothing and adornment styles historically worn in parts of the Gulf Coast. While modern fashion has changed daily life across Iran, older photographs and oral histories describe garments and decorative styles that show clear connections to Indian Ocean trade networks. Beads, fabrics, and design patterns moved along the same routes as spices and gold. Cultural exchange did not stop at the marketplace. Food traditions tell a similar story. Dishes prepared in coastal households often combine Persian ingredients with cooking methods that reflect broader Indian Ocean influences. Coconut, certain spice blends, and slow cooking techniques appear in recipes that differ from the cuisine typically associated with northern Iran. These culinary details may seem small, but they reveal how global trade networks shaped everyday life. When merchants and sailors move across oceans for centuries, their food, music, and customs move with them. Over time, those influences settle into local culture. But despite this rich history, Afro-Iranian communities rarely appear in international discussions about Iran. Part of the reason is geography. Most outsiders think about Iran in terms of its major cities, Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, or its ancient historical sites connected to Persian empires. The southern coastal provinces receive far less global attention. They are physically distant from the country's political center and historically less prominent in narratives about ancient Persian civilization. As a result, many of the region's unique cultural communities remain outside the spotlight. Another reason is the way global history is often taught. Textbooks tend to divide the world into separate regions with their own isolated stories. African history is discussed separately from Middle Eastern history. Indian Ocean trade sometimes appears as a small chapter rather than a central force shaping entire societies. This structure makes it difficult to see how deeply interconnected these regions actually were. Afro-Iranian history sits right at the intersection of those connections. It cannot be fully understood without looking at Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean together. When those histories are separated, the story becomes harder to recognize. Yet evidence of that connection exists everywhere along the Gulf Coast, in music played during community gatherings, in dialects spoken in certain neighborhoods, in family histories describing ancestors who arrived from across the sea generations ago, even in physical features passed down through centuries of mixed heritage. These elements remind us that the Persian Gulf was never just a regional waterway. It was a highway linking continents, and the people who lived along its shores carried the influence of those connections in their daily lives. Today, Afro-Iranians continue to live primarily in southern provinces such as Hormozgan and parts of Khuzestan. In cities and villages scattered along the coastline, families maintain cultural traditions that connect them to both Iranian society and their distant African roots. Their identity reflects centuries of adaptation. They are Iranian in language, citizenship, and national culture. But their history also reaches beyond Iran's borders into the wider Indian Ocean world. This dual heritage makes their story especially important. It demonstrates how national identity and global history can intersect in unexpected ways. Communities like this challenge the idea that cultures exist in neat, separate categories. Instead, they reveal a world shaped by migration, trade, and exchange. And in a time when global discussions often focus on division between nations, religions, or ethnic groups, the history of Afro-Iranians offers a different perspective. It shows that human societies have always been connected, even when those connections were forgotten. Because long before modern globalization, people were already building networks that stretched across oceans, and the descendants of those networks are still living along the shores of the Persian Gulf today. What makes the Afro-Iranian story especially powerful is that it exposes a hidden layer of global history most people never learn about. When people imagine historical trade routes, they usually think of the Silk Road stretching across Central Asia. Caravans carrying silk, spices, and precious metals across deserts and mountains. But at the exact same time, another massive trading system existed on water, the Indian Ocean Network, and in many ways, it was even more efficient than land routes. Ships could carry larger cargo. Travel distances were enormous. Entire civilizations were linked together through maritime trade centuries before European colonial empires appeared. East African ports connected directly to the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf connected to India. India connected to Southeast Asia. Every stop along that chain exchanged goods, cultures, and people. Southern Iran sat right in the middle of this system. Ports along the coast became entry points where merchants, sailors, and travelers arrived from multiple directions. This constant movement shaped the population of the region in ways that modern national borders don't fully reflect. Afro-Iranian communities are part of that legacy. Their ancestors arrived through this network long before modern globalization. Some came through forced migration tied to slavery. Others arrived through maritime work or commercial travel. Over time, those different paths blended together. Once people settled in coastal towns, they built lives that connected them to local society. Families formed across cultural backgrounds. Children grew up speaking Persian while still carrying visible African ancestry. Generations later, the result was a community that was fully Iranian, but still carried traces of an older transoceanic history. What's striking is how normal this kind of cultural mixture was in port cities. Throughout history, ports have rarely been culturally pure places. They are crossroads. Ships arrive carrying merchants from different languages and religions. Goods change hands quickly. Ideas move just as fast as cargo. Communities living in those environments naturally become diverse. That pattern appears everywhere. Maritime trade flourished. Zanzibar, Muscat, Mumbai, Malacca. Southern Iran belongs on that list. But because global narratives about Iran often focus on politics, nuclear diplomacy, or ancient Persian empires, the maritime dimension of its history gets overshadowed. That means the role of Indian Ocean trade and the communities shaped by it rarely enters the conversation. Afro-Iranians exist in that overlooked space. They represent a history that doesn't fit neatly into the dominant images people hold about Iran. Yet their presence proves something important. The Persian Gulf was never isolated from Africa. In fact, for centuries it was directly connected to the East African coast through regular shipping routes. Traders from places like modern-day Tanzania, Kenya, and Mozambique interacted constantly with merchants in Gulf ports. Cultural influence flowed both directions. African sailors adopted elements of Gulf culture. Gulf merchants incorporated African goods and traditions into their own societies. Over generations, those exchanges created families and communities that blurred geographic boundaries. One reason this history remains relatively unknown is the way written records were produced. Many of the people involved in Indian Ocean trade, sailors, laborers, fishermen, did not leave extensive written documentation behind. Their stories survived mainly through oral history and cultural traditions. Meanwhile, official chronicles often focused on rulers, wars, and political developments rather than everyday maritime life. As a result, the human dimension of Indian Ocean history sometimes gets lost unless researchers actively seek it out. In recent decades, historians and anthropologists have begun doing exactly that. By studying music traditions, dialects, genetic patterns, and oral storytelling, scholars have uncovered clearer evidence of African ancestry within several Gulf communities. Afro-Iranian populations are part of that broader research. Their cultural practices help historians reconstruct a picture of how people moved and interacted across the ocean centuries ago. These discoveries are slowly reshaping our understanding of the region. Instead of seeing the Persian Gulf only through the lens of oil wealth or modern geopolitics, researchers are recognizing it as part of a much older global system. A system that connected Africa, Arabia, Persia, and South Asia long before modern nation-states existed. That realization matters because it changes how we interpret identity. When we recognize that entire communities were formed through centuries of cross-continental interaction, the idea of rigid cultural boundaries starts to break down. History becomes less about isolated civilizations and more about networks of exchange. Afro-Iranians illustrate that perfectly. They are not simply a minority group inside Iran. They are evidence of a historical process that linked continents through trade, migration, and cultural blending. Their story shows that identity can evolve across oceans and generations. It also highlights something deeper about how history is remembered. Communities tied to powerful empires or major political events often dominate textbooks and documentaries, but many of the people who actually built global trade networks, sailors, dock workers, pearl divers, laborers, rarely appear in those narratives. Yet without them, those networks would never have existed. Afro-Iranian ancestors were part of that workforce that powered maritime economies for centuries. Their labor helped sustain trade routes that connected distant parts of the world. Their cultural traditions preserved memories of those connections long after the original systems changed. Today, those traditions remain scattered along the Gulf Coast, sometimes in music, sometimes in food, sometimes simply in family stories about ancestors who crossed the sea generations ago. Each piece may seem small on its own, but together they reveal something extraordinary. They reveal that the story of Iran and the story of the Persian Gulf is not just about empires, oil, or modern politics. It is also about oceans, migration, and a forgotten African connection that has existed quietly along the coast for centuries. If you zoom out even further, the Afro-Iranian story becomes part of a much larger pattern that shaped the entire Indian Ocean world. For most of human history, the Indian Ocean was one of the busiest trade zones on Earth. Long before Europeans began exploring global sea routes in the 15th century, merchants in this region had already built a functioning international economy. The key to that system was the monsoon wind cycle. Every year, predictable seasonal winds allowed ships to travel enormous distances with surprising efficiency. Sailors would leave East Africa when the winds pushed eastward, reach ports in Arabia or the Persian Gulf, and then return months later when the winds reversed. Because the pattern repeated every year, traders could plan entire commercial networks around it. Ports across the ocean gradually became permanent trading hubs. Zanzibar connected African interior trade to maritime routes. Ports in Oman and the Persian Gulf linked those African goods to markets in Persia and Mesopotamia. Indian cities acted as distribution centers, sending textiles, spices, and manufactured goods back across the ocean. What this created was not just a trade route, but a trading civilization. Merchants, sailors, translators, craftsmen, and laborers all moved along these same maritime corridors. Cultural ideas traveled with them. Religion spread through merchant communities. Languages blended together in port marketplaces, and families formed between people whose ancestors came from completely different continents. Afro-Iranian communities emerged from this exact environment. Their ancestors were not isolated individuals suddenly appearing in Iran. They were part of a centuries-long pattern of movement connecting East Africa to the Gulf. Some arrived under harsh conditions tied to systems of slavery that existed across the Indian Ocean. Others came through maritime employment or commercial migration. Once they settled in coastal towns, their lives became tied to the rhythms of Gulf society. They worked in industries that depended on the sea: pearl diving, fishing, sailing, and port labor. Those industries defined the coastal economy for generations. Pearl diving in particular was physically brutal work. Divers would descend repeatedly into deep water with little equipment, holding their breath while searching for oysters on the seafloor. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and seasonal. Yet pearls from the Persian Gulf were once among the most valuable luxury goods in the world. For centuries, wealthy buyers in Europe, India, and the Ottoman Empire prized natural Gulf pearls for their quality. That demand created a thriving maritime industry across the region. Large fleets of boats would leave coastal towns each season with crews composed of divers, rope pullers, captains, and merchants. Afro-Iranian laborers were heavily involved in these operations. The work required strength, endurance, and deep familiarity with the sea. Many coastal families developed diving traditions that passed from father to son. During pearl season, entire towns revolved around the industry. Boats filled the harbors. Merchants prepared trade shipments. Families waited months for the fleets to return with whatever fortune the ocean might provide. This system lasted for centuries. But like many traditional economies, it eventually collided with technological change. In the early 20th century, cultured pearl farming developed in East Asia. Suddenly, pearls could be produced in controlled environments rather than harvested through dangerous diving expeditions. The global pearl market collapsed almost overnight. For Gulf communities that depended on natural pearl diving, the consequences were devastating. Hundreds of boats stopped operating. Merchants who financed diving fleets lost their investments. Coastal towns that had relied on this industry for generations suddenly faced economic collapse. Afro-Iranian communities were among those hardest hit. Many families had built their livelihoods around maritime labor tied to pearl diving and related trades. When the industry disappeared, they had to find new ways to survive. At almost the same time, another economic transformation began reshaping the region: oil. By the mid-20th century, petroleum had become the dominant economic force in the Persian Gulf. New wealth flowed into national governments and industrial projects connected to energy production. But oil development did not automatically benefit every coastal town. Major infrastructure projects focused on specific locations where drilling, refining, and shipping operations were based. Smaller communities that had once thrived on maritime industries sometimes remained outside those new economic centers. This created an uneven economic landscape along parts of the Gulf Coast. Massive oil tankers sailed through waters that once carried pearl fleets. Yet some of the nearby communities whose ancestors had worked those seas for centuries saw relatively little of the wealth passing by. Afro-Iranian families, many of whom still lived in those coastal areas, adapted as best they could. Some moved toward growing cities where industrial jobs were available. Others stayed in traditional towns, shifting toward fishing, small-scale trade, or service work. Through all these changes, their cultural traditions continued quietly in the background. Music, ceremonies, and family storytelling preserved fragments of memory about the past. These traditions didn't always appear in official historical records, but they survived in everyday life. And that survival tells us something important. Communities shaped by centuries of migration rarely disappear completely. They adapt. They blend into new social environments. They carry pieces of their past forward in ways that may not always be obvious to outsiders. Afro-Iranians today are living proof of that process. Their existence shows that the Indian Ocean world was never just about ships and trade goods. It was also about people building lives across continents. And even though many of those historical connections faded from public awareness, the descendants of that era are still there along the Persian Gulf coast, quietly carrying a story that links Africa and Iran through centuries of shared history. To understand why the Afro-Iranian story matters today, you have to step back and ask a bigger question. Why do some histories become global knowledge, while others disappear almost completely? The answer usually has nothing to do with how important the story actually is. It has everything to do with power, documentation, and attention. Histories connected to empires, wars, and powerful governments tend to dominate the historical record. They are written down, preserved in archives, and repeated in textbooks for generations. But the lives of sailors, laborers, fishermen, and small coastal communities rarely receive the same treatment. Their contributions shape entire economic systems, yet their stories often survive only through oral memory and local tradition. That is exactly what happened along the Persian Gulf. For centuries, the region's coastal economy depended on maritime labor. Pearl divers risked their lives underwater. Sailors navigated dangerous monsoon routes. Dock workers unloaded cargo from ships arriving from Africa, India, and Arabia. Afro-Iranian ancestors were part of that workforce. They were not kings or generals. They did not leave behind famous written chronicles, but their labor supported the trade networks that connected continents. Without those workers, the Indian Ocean trading system would never have functioned. Yet when global narratives about history developed, the spotlight shifted elsewhere. European colonial expansion became the dominant story of maritime history. Atlantic trade overshadowed the Indian Ocean networks that had existed for centuries before Europeans arrived. As a result, the African diaspora became widely associated with the Atlantic slave trade in the Americas. That story is undeniably important, but it is not the whole picture. Across the Indian Ocean, African communities formed in multiple regions through migration, trade, and systems of forced labor that operated for hundreds of years. Some of those descendants live today in Oman, others in Pakistan and Western India, and others along the southern coast of Iran. Their existence expands the map of the African diaspora far beyond the Atlantic world. It shows that African history and global history have always been intertwined across multiple oceans. Afro-Iranians are part of that wider human story. Their communities demonstrate how migration and cultural exchange shaped societies long before modern globalization. They also challenge the simplified idea that cultures belong exclusively to one geographic place. African heritage exists not only in Africa and the Americas, but also in unexpected places like the Persian Gulf. And yet, despite centuries of presence, Afro-Iranians remain largely unknown outside the region. Many people around the world would be surprised to learn that an African-descended population exists inside Iran at all. That lack of awareness is exactly why their story deserves attention, because when hidden histories are uncovered, they expand our understanding of how the world actually developed. They remind us that human societies have always been more interconnected than national narratives suggest. The Persian Gulf was never just a regional body of water. It was part of a vast maritime highway connecting Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, and the people who lived along its shores reflected those connections. Afro-Iranians represent the human side of that network. Their ancestors crossed oceans. They survived difficult systems of labor and migration. They built communities in unfamiliar lands and blended cultures across generations. Today, their descendants continue to live in coastal provinces of Iran, carrying both Iranian identity and distant African heritage. In daily life, that heritage might appear subtle: a rhythm in music, a tradition during a community ceremony, a family story about ancestors who arrived from across the sea. These elements may seem small, but together they preserve a historical memory stretching back centuries. They remind us that the Indian Ocean world was not just about trade routes and cargo. It was about people. People who moved across vast distances. People who built families in places far from where their ancestors began. People who created new identities that reflected multiple cultures at once. Afro-Iranians are one of the clearest examples of that process. Their story forces us to rethink how history is organized. Instead of viewing continents as separate cultural worlds, it reveals a past where Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia were deeply connected. Ships carried goods across the ocean, but they also carried human lives and traditions that reshaped entire societies. Those connections still exist today, even if they are often overlooked. And once you recognize them, it becomes impossible to see the Persian Gulf the same way again. It is not just a geopolitical hotspot or an oil shipping route. It is a crossroads of civilizations, a place where African, Arab, Persian, and South Asian histories have intersected for centuries. Afro-Iranian communities are living evidence of that intersection. Their presence tells a story that textbooks rarely mention, but history cannot erase. A story about oceans, migration, survival, and cultural blending. A story proving that the African diaspora reached far beyond the Atlantic world. And a story reminding us that sometimes the most fascinating parts of global history are the ones that have been hiding in plain sight all along.